hold a breadfruit in your hand, and it does not immediately explain itself. It is heavy, green, rough-skinned, and bluntly practical. Not jewel-bright like dragon fruit, not delicate like a fig, more like a piece of food that has work to do. And that is the strange thing. This quiet fruit once had the attention of an empire. Breadfruit is a starchy fruit from a tree, not a grain from a field. In many places it is cooked, filling, and ordinary in the best possible sense, food that can stand under a household. But this story begins with the shock of scale. One fruit, growing on one kind of Pacific tree, became important enough for Britain to send a ship across the world. Not because it was rare, not because it was glamorous, because someone looked at it and imagined a system. That ship was HMS Bounty. Most people see the Bounty as a mutiny story. William Bligh, Fletcher Christian, Tahiti, anger, command, and men turning against the voyage. But before it became that story, it was something quieter and stranger. It was a plant transport mission. The Bounty had been sent to Tahiti to collect living breadfruit plants and carry them across the ocean toward the Caribbean. The ship was not only a stage for sailors, it was a floating nursery, built around keeping trees alive at sea. Before Britain looked at it, Pacific peoples had already carried it, cultivated it, named it, cooked it, and lived with it. So to understand why the Bounty sailed, we have to look at the tree before the Empire did. Before breadfruit became cargo for a British ship, it had already travelled by older routes. Not as a curiosity, not as a specimen, as food. Across much of Oceania, breadfruit was carried, planted, selected, and lived with by voyaging peoples. It belonged to a world of canoes, islands, households, gardens, hunger and abundance. Breadfruit was not just something people found in a forest and admired, it was something people moved with. In simple terms, new trees could be grown from living pieces of old ones, so the plant could travel as a companion, carried, protected, replanted, and made local again. So when Britain later looked at breadfruit, it was not seeing an empty plant, it was seeing someone else's food system. In one version of a Hawaiian legend, the story tells of Ku living among people, facing famine with his family. When hunger closes in, he gives himself to the earth. From that place, the ulu tree grows, and the family is fed. It is a very different way of seeing the same plant, not as cheap supply, not as imperial cargo, not as a solution drawn up in someone else's paperwork. In Ku's story, breadfruit begins with sacrifice, soil, family, and the return of food when there is nothing left. Breadfruit already carried meanings of survival and abundance before it entered imperial plans. It was already rooted in human life. Then Britain looked at that same kind of tree and saw something else entirely, a cheaper way to feed labour. Britain did not look at breadfruit and only see a beautiful Pacific food tree. They saw a crop that might solve a problem for the sugar colonies. Not a moral problem, a cost problem. Sugar plantations depended on enslaved labour, and feeding that labour cost money. Breadfruit looked useful because it was productive, filling, and grown from a tree that could keep giving food year after year. The Bounty was not sent across the world because breadfruit was charming. It was sent because planters wanted a cheaper way to provision enslaved workers. The same tree that could mean abundance in one world became in another a calculation. But there was a very real practical problem to solve. You could not simply throw this mission into sacks. Many important breadfruit forms had to be moved as living plant material. living pieces, living shoots, living young trees. This was not storage, it was care. So the Bounty had to become something more delicate than a normal cargo ship. It became a kind of greenhouse at sea. Space was made for plants, water had to be managed, light mattered, care mattered. The ship was carrying food that was not yet food, trees that had to survive long enough to become useful somewhere else. The ship sailed toward Tahiti to collect breadfruit and carry it onward to the Caribbean. But the plants that gave the mission its purpose would never reach the Caribbean on that first voyage.
By the time the Bounty left Tahiti, the mission had finally become visible in the ship itself. Living breadfruit plants were aboard. Trees had been collected, tended, and loaded for the long passage toward the Caribbean. The quiet, green fruit from the opening was no longer just an object in the hand. It was counted cargo, living cargo, the reason the ship had crossed so much ocean. Then, in April 1789, the voyage broke. The mutiny on the Bounty has been argued over ever since. Command, resentment, loyalty, fear, and the pressures of life at sea. Breadfruit should not be made into a single cause. That would make the story too neat. But breadfruit explains why the ship was there. It explains why the Bounty had been reshaped, and why, after Bligh and loyal men were cast adrift, the plants were thrown overboard. The fruit mission sank with them, but the imperial idea did not.
The Empire tried again. Bligh returned on a second breadfruit mission, this time on HMS Providence, and this time the plants survived the crossing. In 1793, breadfruit was delivered to St. Vincent and Jamaica, exactly where the first voyage had meant to send it. The tree arrived, carrying all the contradictions of the route that moved it. In the Pacific, breadfruit had been food, continuity, and a household abundance. To the British Empire, it had become a cheaper way to provision enslaved workers in sugar colonies. In the Caribbean, it entered through that coercive plantation world, but its later life could not be owned by that intention alone. Over time, breadfruit became part of Caribbean foodways too, cooked, adapted, remembered, and made ordinary in kitchens and meals that empires could not fully script. So hold the fruit again. The same rough green breadfruit now carries canoe voyages, famine stories, imperial calculation, mutiny, plantation coercion, survival, and home. It was never just fruit. It depended on who was holding it.